Hello. Welcome to the Behavioral Finance Dialogues on Corona Crisis video series. My name is Gulnur Muradoglu. I'm a professor of finance and director of the Behavioral Finance Working Group. I work for the School of Business and Management at Queen Mary University of London. Today, I will be speaking with my colleague, Professor Avanidhar Subrahmanyam, Subra, University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA. We will discuss Corona crisis and financial crisis. And we will talk about the common behavioral characteristics in both. If you enjoyed this video, please share it and subscribe to the Queen Mary University of London YouTube channel. And please come back and listen to the other talks in the series. Thank you very much for coming, Subra. What's the difference or what's the similarity between the common behavioral characteristics of the Corona crisis and the 2008 crisis?
Okay, yeah, so the financial crisis of 2008 affected mainly financial firms who had bought these mortgage-backed securities without quite understanding them, and also people who had overcommitted to real estate at inflated prices without having the means to actually pay back the mortgage in a financial crisis. So it was affecting people, but in a narrower way. In the Corona crisis, almost the entire world's population is affected. And so I would argue that the difference is that a broader section of the population is affected by the Corona crisis, which means that the recovery from this crisis would be more prolonged than from the financial crisis.
In the UK, the estimates are from the Bank of England about 15% fall in GDP, and that's comparable to a crisis 300 years ago in 1979. It's a big crisis, and it's coming from the demand side. It's demand induced. And what are you expecting on consumption, job losses, and the behavioral factors in the development of the crisis that leads to them?
Yes, I think the contraction in the United States is projected to be less than that in the UK. We are saying that the GDP will contract about 8 to 9%, which is slightly lower. The difference in the UK, between the UK and the US, seems to be that that the tech firms here are booming, whether rationally or not, I don't know, but the tech firms are booming because people are saying that if you stay at home, that obviously the tech sector will be in a better shape. So I think that the stock market here is not suffering as much as in other countries because of the basically the tech sector carrying things basically on its own. So that's the difference. As far as the unemployment part is concerned, I think the situation is very similar. I think we're expecting what 20%, 25% employment, and that's historic. Once in a century event. So it's going to be fairly dramatic on that front. So those are the differences. Yeah.
And the cash injections this time are directly made to the households in terms of payments for furlough or unemployment payments. And in the previous crisis, they were made into the financial sector. Do you think that would speed up the recovery in consumer demand?
Yeah, so I think that paying people £1,000 or $1,000 is actually a very useful thing to do. And that'll help tide them over to some extent in this crisis. Some people actually are suffering from a lack of basic needs like food, and so it would really help. But for a broader based recovery, I think consumer sentiment has to recover, which would imply that consumer spending would recover. When consumer sentiment would recover from this situation is somewhat difficult to predict, probably take a year or so, because of the simple reason that this particular situation affects most people. And I think that I don't think it's a matter of giving people money to spend. It's a question of psychologically when they are ready to spend. And that's going to take longer, right? That's the big issue here. So in fact, if you have enough food on the table, you'd rather save the stimulus payment because you think there are going to be darker days ahead, and you would just save it for those days rather than worry about spending the entire check now if your basic needs are met. Right? So that's the flip side of it. The sentiment has to recover.
And probably there are several biases at work because of the big fear of death, is a very fundamental, instinctive survival thing. And
Right, absolutely. Yeah.
in the development of the crisis, how does fear work? And
Sure.
beginning in the UK, in the US, almost all around the world, we've seen supermarket runs very similar to bank runs.
Absolutely. And I think these runs are a classic demonstration of the fear psychosis. But I think that the whole episode is a classic demonstration of many behavioral biases that we teach our students in behavioral finance. A couple of the more major biases are the availability bias and the representativeness bias. So people, when reacting to dramatic events, overestimate the likelihood of the event. So they're very bad about understanding tail probabilities, and generally they tend to overreact because of that. So for example, although the virus is very bad, I think that one statistic that people will have difficulty grasping is the fact that 99.8% of the people that are infected will actually recover. That is 99% of the people, 99.8% of the people that were actually infected, not of the population. But if you look at the tabloid newspapers like Daily Mail and Sun, you wouldn't think that that's true because of the nature of the popular press that also exploits the notion of the availability bias. So the press gets more clicks from dramatic stories about COVID-19 cases, and people click on them and don't quite understand that tail events are just that, tail events. It's like winning the lottery, and it's a downside of dying from the virus. So it's while the virus is very bad, and obviously if I'm 57, it's more likely to hit me and create an adverse effect on me than other people. I understand that, but for many people younger than me, the risk is far lower, and it's much lower than what people think it is. So I'm not denying the virus is very serious, but I'm also saying that people are bad at assessing tail probabilities, and that ties into the representativeness bias, which is the base rate. People react to the dramatic nature of the event, but don't understand the base rate, which is basically, like I said, 99.8% of the people who get infected will recover from the virus. So yeah, that creates difficulty in consumer spending and getting consumer sentiment back on track. So it prolongs the recovery.
Yeah, I'm 59 myself, and I'm very aware that I'm, compared to young people, I am at a higher death probability. And I'm good at my statistics, but I still find it very difficult to absorb the information given in the press in terms of probabilities, in terms of the base rates for comparison. I find it very, very difficult myself to absorb what the actual information is. And therefore, I think the fear grows, and then you overreact to that information. And probably,
absolutely,
even if the shutdown is terminated, the recovery will take some time for many, many businesses.
Correct. I think that's absolutely true. Like I said, the problem is that the way we get our news is also an issue. So we get our news from the sources which rely on clicks and sales to actually survive. And people click on dramatic stories much more than anything else. For example, there's an issue going on with children right now, which is that they get some sort of inflammatory syndrome with this virus, which is an extremely rare event in a handful of children, but you can see the psychosis this would create and create a barrier to sending children back to school, which would further prolong the recovery. I'm not saying that it's not a serious condition, but there is a risk in everything we do. There is risk whenever we step out. And so we have to assess the risk rationally. And you're absolutely right that even I sometimes have difficulty assessing the base rate. So I have to force myself to assess the base rate when I react to these events. And yeah, that's true.
Yeah, and it's very general that people underestimate the big probabilities and overestimate the small probabilities, isn't it?
That's absolutely true. Exactly right. Yeah.
And in this case too, I mean, the big probability is the severity of the financial crisis. And I think that gets underestimated. And even the conservative estimates, say from the Bank of England or the IMF, are very high. And still that gets underestimated. At the same time, it's a fundamental thing, the survival strategy to live, but the death statistics can be overestimated, at least in our minds as well, isn't it?
Absolutely. I think that's essentially what's going on, that people are underestimating the extent of the financial crisis and the time it would take to recover, and overestimating the, in a personal level, the risk of the virus itself. So when people say, oh, this virus is not that serious, that's true. But an individual consumer deciding whether to actually go out there and go to a retail store and buy things, or an individual customer trying to go to a bookstore, or an individual customer trying to decide whether to send their child to school and go back to work, until they do all those things, we won't recover. And the question is whether they can assess the probabilities rationally and go out there into the world and start behaving normally. And that's where I think the problem is, that it would take a long time for that to happen. So hopefully it happens sooner rather than later as people become more rational about this, but let's see.
In the previous crisis, cash injections were made through the banking sector, and the cash injections are made directly to the households in the form of furloughs, unemployment payments, etc. Do you think that that will speed up the recovery?
Right. I think, yeah, I think that the problem, if you send cash to people, I mean, some people are struggling for basic needs such as food. It will really help them in regard to that. But let's say if you have your basic needs met, you might be tempted to do the following: is save the check for more rainy days ahead. And you might think that there are more rainy days ahead and save the check, and that's a very likely outcome. So I think that the bigger problem here is sending people £1,000 or $1,000 in the post doesn't address the issue that consumer sentiment has to come back. It's the sentiment that has to change, not how much money people have. Until sentiment changes, people won't go back to work, and they won't start spending again. And that's essentially where the problem is. So I think that the more we can do to change the sentiment of the people than sending them money via proper education programs and so on and so forth, the better off we would be. But I think the key issue here is that psychology of the consumer, and when the sentiment changes to something more positive, that would be where we could see some more recovery in a prolonged way. So
when do you think the sentiment will change?
Oh, that's an excellent question. I mean, I don't know. I think that there has to be some trigger in the statistics that has to actually flip the people's way of thinking. For example, the number of infections has to slow. The number of deaths has to come back to something more reasonable, like in the sense that when the public looks at this number and says, okay, now the risk to me is extremely low. And at that particular point in time, there might be a flood of people willing to, take the tube more, go to Oxford and Bond Streets more, go and shop more, and be comfortable sending their children to school. And I think there'd be a trigger point at which the statistics, in fact, change in a good way, where we would see people changing their minds on this thing. But when that thing's going to happen is very much up in the air at this particular moment, right? It all depends on how seriously the public actually takes the actual statistics and so on and so forth. So I would say that it would take about 6 to 8 months at the minimum, I would say, but we'll see. Maybe it'll be sooner. That would be my position.
Thank you very much. So hope the sentiment changes sooner rather than later.
So, thank you. Thanks, Gulnur. Okay, thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.